Hello, Ian here with another demo. This time I'm going to show you how I created the electricity spell from our magic sound effects pack. Right, let's listen to the spell. Now, as with all these magic spells, there's three key elements. There's the start of the spell, where it sounds like the magician waving their wand to begin the spell. There's the build-up, which is when all the spell effects kind of rise and rise and rise in volume and pitch. And then there's the impact, the moment the spell hits its target and the spell's effect goes off and then fades out. So I'm going to talk you through all the sounds I've used. I've divided the sounds into high sounds, mid sounds, and low sounds. But just keep those three elements, the start, the build-up, and the impact in mind as you listen to these. So let's start with the high-pitched sounds. As you can hear, lots of very typical electricity sounds, lots of zaps. I will start off by showing you this circuit interference sound. I'm not 100% sure what the origin of this sound is. It must be some electricity that's passing through a circuit being interfered by something so that you can hear it. What I've done to it, I've changed it in a few ways just to accentuate that build-up from silence up to the moment of impact. So I've automated volume, so it starts silent and builds up and up and up as the sound goes on. I've also added some a filter to the sound. If you watch this knob here, you'll see as the sound progresses, more and more of the high frequencies are opened up. And finally, I've pitch shifted the sound, so it goes from low pitch to high pitch. Now for this, I go to, I click on the audio, I go audio processes, pitch shift. This is in Cubase. And then I open the envelope section, go down to the bottom here, go to the top here, choose the amount of semitones that I want it to shift by and press process. You can also choose different options here that change the kind of tone and the quality of the pitch shift. But anyway, the reason I do this is because what you want to sell is the idea that this magic spell is building up to something, that impact is something that has been built up to as the magical powers kind of combine together. So yeah, all these different things just really help to sell that build-up. Okay, now we have some very kind of stereotypical electrical zapping sounds. Now what I've done here is I've actually pitch shifted the zapping sounds so that they're a little bit higher pitched before the moment of impact and a little bit lower pitched after the moment of impact. There's not really a huge reason for me doing this other than me wanting to distinguish those two sounds so that at the moment of impact, the tone of the electricity changes slightly, almost as if it goes from the electricity travelling through the air towards its target to the electricity actually zapping the target. The way that I've done this transition is I've used this spark sound, which I'll play on its own, just to really sell that moment where it changes from one pitch to another. This spark sound happens at the moment of impact, the moment that the spell hits home, and so also helps with adding some strength and impact to the higher frequencies of that moment. Okay, next we have these chimes rising in pitch. I've used this in a few other of my magic spell sounds as well. It's the sound of some chimes that I've pitch shifted upwards using the same technique I showed you earlier. I did this for the exact same reason, because I want that to have that build up towards the moment of impact and to cover those higher frequency sounds. Chimes are really, really good for magic spells because people hear them and they just sound magical. And pitch shifting it up also gives it a slightly otherworldly quality, something a little bit different to your usual chime sounds. Okay, next we have this sci-fi synth sound. This sound is the sound of the spell starting. As I mentioned before, there's those three key elements, and one of those is the sound of the spell starting, the sound of the magician, waving their wand and the spell going off. Now, because this is an electricity spell, we can get away with using more synthetic sounds. We can get away with using things that normally would sound a bit more like sci-fi. And for this sound, not only have I used this kind of unusual kind of synthy sound for that starting moment, but I've also added some diffusion delay onto it, which works kind of like a reverb. It has a slightly different tone to a reverb. It's not the same as normal delay. It's much more echoey and kind of ambient. But it's nice because it gives it a nice tail. Without it, the sound sounds very dry. As you can tell, it just ends suddenly. So with it, we get this nice kind of fade out. So it's important to have a strong start to the sound. It doesn't want to be so strong that it outshines the actual impact sound, but you want people to know that this spell isn't coming from nowhere, it's coming from something. It's coming in this, you know, in your imagination you can imagine coming from a wizard waving their wand, or from a monster casting a spell. And finally we have these more standard chime sounds. I like to use chime sounds in my magic spell sounds just because, again, they invoke a magical feeling. They fill out the top range nicely, just that twinkle just sounds magical. Okay, on to the mid-range sounds. Okay, let's start with this sound of a dying Casio. Now this, I believe, is a synth that's kind of on its last legs, not really working properly. As you can see, I've done the same thing before, where I've actually pitch shifted the second half. In this case, the second half is a little bit higher pitched than the first half. I've done this for the same reason I did before. I wanted to distinguish the build-up sound from the actual impact sound. I wanted it to have a slightly different tone to it. And the change is quite jarring, it's quite sudden, but you can get away with it with these electrical sounds because they are quite impactful. They do kind of come in and out very drastically anyway, so that sudden change in pitch just adds to the kind of the drama and impact of that moment where the spell actually impacts its target. Next is this Synth Rise. Another kind of synthy sound that sounds very sci-fi-esque, but because it's an electrical spell we can get away with it. It rises in pitch, which is perfect for the build-up. Just another layer to help with that build-up. Something a little bit more mid-rangey on top of those higher pitch sounds that we heard before to help build up to the moment of impact. Speaking of the moment of impact, here is our rocket going off. This sound is quite crucial. Just it's there to really add some body to the sound, really add some strength to that moment of impact. It doesn't have anything to do with electricity, it's just there as a kind of more generic boom underneath all the electrical sounds, just to really sell that impact. And now we have the sound of this actual same rocket taking off. And I've used this sound in a few different of my spells, and I like it because it really, to me, sounds, again, like the magician waving their wand. It sounds like the start of something before the build. And now this synthy whoosh sound. Again, same reason as before, it's something that it sounds kind of synthy, but that works for electrical sounds. It builds up in volume. This one builds up less in pitch, but it does build up in volume. And this one kind of goes into that moment of impact and then fades, and it has this nice kind of quality, almost like the sound has built up too much and is kind of spinning around itself. Let's listen to it one more time. You can hear it with that kind of delay effect. It sounds almost like this thing has built up so much energy that it can't quite keep up with itself. This idea of energy building up is perfect for a spell, especially as you build to that moment of impact. Okay, finally we have the low pitch sounds. Let's take a listen to those. Okay, I'll talk you through those one by one. Let's start with these whooshing sounds. These whoosh by sounds. I mean, these sounds are almost like futuristic cars whooshing by. Again, a very sci-fi sound in nature, but for an electricity spell, it works. Because, you know, electricity is, by its nature, something that we kind of associate with futuristic stuff anyway. So, I like these sounds because they have that build up in pitch and then down again, but still very bassy. They're filling out the body of the sound, but they also, similar to the synthy whoosh sound I showed you before, they have this feeling, this sound like they're whooshing around themselves, like they're getting faster and faster and faster and faster until they just get too fast to handle themselves and just sort of disappear, which I really, really like. It's a building up of energy, a building up of the body of the sound leading up to that impact, and then fading out again afterwards. Next we have this long whoosh sound. This is kind of a more generic whoosh. It's here just to add some body to the sound. When you hear the entire sound together, you can't really make this sound out very much, but it is there and it does help. It just adds a little bit more bass to the sound and a little bit of a nice magical kind of echoey whoosh. That something that doesn't just sound like electricity, also just sounds like more generic magic sounds, which is important. You don't want to just go 100% electricity, because then the listener won't recognize that this is supposed to be a magic spell. So it's just something a little bit more magical. Next we have these bass rising and falling sounds. I really like these. This is actually originally just a sound that goes down, but I took the sound, I reversed it by going to Audio Processes Reverse. I changed the automation so that it fades in, and that's how we get this kind of rise up before we get the rise down. And these sounds kind of end very suddenly. They end in a way that doesn't quite sound right. Like that moment where it switches from one to the other, there's almost like a pop there, which really, as someone doing audio, you don't usually want that. But actually, for an electricity sound, it's fine. It actually helps. It adds this kind of very sudden change that I'm going for with the other sounds. This thing where at the moment of impact, suddenly everything kind of shifts to something else in a very, very rapid rate. So that kind of very sudden pop from one sound to the next is perfectly fine here. Okay, right, I've taught you through all the sounds, so let's just listen to the full spell one final time. And you can hear everything together. Okay, I hope this was useful. Thanks for listening.